Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's really cool to kind of bookend this room from what I did yesterday in this one, and it's considering the weather and all the trains and the fun that's happening today. Either I'm really impressed that you're still here, or I apologize for the fact that you're stuck, and good luck. Whichever one of the two that is. So, I love working with my colleagues. I absolutely love it when I can bounce ideas between each other and figure out how to do things better, how we can complement each other's knowledge and use that bigger set of knowledge to solve complex technical or business challenges. Basically, I adore working in really close-knit teams. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened quite as often as I would have liked throughout my career. All too often, I have seen teams where everybody's working on something different. Either they're working on different stories in the same project, or in the worst case that I see far too often is people actually working in completely different projects, but supposedly still in the same team. Everybody's working on something different. And they do that so that they can be, sometimes so that they have to be, or because they have to be, independent from each other. And I find that an interesting word, independent. Because if we're supposed to be in a team situation, are we a team if we're independent? Or are we simply a collection of developers sitting at the same island of desks, working on our own? And this word, independent, it's not free. It comes with costs, even if you don't see it at the time. Inside of my team, if everybody's doing different things, I have less insight into what my team's doing. I have less insight into what my colleagues are doing. That 15-minute stand-up at the start of the day, which, let's face it, can be interesting at the best of times, suddenly becomes an absolute zone-out fest. Because you're sitting there listening to somebody talk about something that you've got no idea about. You're not involved in any way, shape, or form. And you just zone out until it's your turn to speak, and then nobody listens to you. And because of this disconnect, because we lose some connection between each other, that whole thing that I love about working with my colleagues, bouncing ideas, helping each other, complementing each other's knowledge, it becomes so much harder. And it becomes harder because when I want to do that bouncing of ideas, I've got to take somebody out of their focus zone. They've got a context switch so that they can work with me, and I've got to get them up to speed with what I'm doing. And it gives our teams other issues as well. One of the main ones that I see is work in progress. If everybody's working on their own set of stories by themselves, then the chances are they're going to have at least 2 stories that are on the go at one time as they hit roadblocks. More often or not, it's 3 or 4 stories on the go, and it can make it really hard to get the lead time of changes down and get things out to our users. And it gives us another problem. And that's resiliency in the team. If one person has their own set of stories, then what happens when that person wins a lottery and they quit the next day? Or maybe more realistically, they go on vacation. Or even if they're just ill and they don't turn up one day. All of these things interrupt our ability to provide value to our users in a reasonable amount of time. But this is supposed to be pair programming, and I've not mentioned that yet. So why do I start with this type of thing? Well, I've found that one very effective way to help teams not fall into that trap of being independent colleagues at the same island of desks is to pair program. When we do this, and when we do it right, we get to work together. And I mean really get to work together. To think of those better solutions, to encourage that better collaboration between everybody, and to implement them in less time. So, hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I am Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan, who's based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We write some financial advice software. And I'm a complete interloper today. I'm really honored to say the last 2 years I've been allowed to call myself a Microsoft MVP. It's awesome to see different communities too. Now, over the course of my career since the mid-1990s, I have worked in lots of different industries. I have worked in lots of different companies in a few different roles. And I've seen so many different ways that teams have worked together over the years. Some of them have been a bit better than others. At my previous company, I was there for 14 years, and I joined when the company was still quite small, and I managed to see quite a few different interpretations of how to work together just inside of one place. When I started, it was all independent people. In fact, my first project on day one by myself was to implement this really complex change in the middle of their car insurance system. There were a couple of bigger projects, but they were split up in the way that nobody really worked together. Everybody had their own facet of the system that they looked at. Now, we saw the issues that this could bring to us. And in 2012, we decided to introduce Scrum, so that we were no longer independent, we now had our own teams, and the teams were responsible for different product groups on our website. So one team had car insurance, one team had mortgages, and we had to focus on that bit rather than constantly switching. It didn't work. And it didn't work because the developers didn't know how to work together. So we still got all the complaints out that we're supposed to be doing this project together, but we can't. We're editing the same part of the site. Sometimes we're even editing the same page. We are in merge hell. This is slowing us down. We've got to do something else. Over the next 6 years or so, each of the different teams tried different things to get around that. The team that I was in when I left, they were spectacular and they loved experimenting. We were always looking for that next step that made us better, but more than that, made our jobs more enjoyable and actually made us want to do it. And pair programming became a huge part of this. It was an amazing learning experience for me, and one of the things I learned is it's really hard. It takes a lot of work to make pair programming actually useful. But for all of that effort that you put it in, when it does work, you get so much back out from it. Now, whenever I speak to friends and colleagues about this, the one thing that I get back is, well, if it's so great, why isn't everybody just doing it? And it's because it is so hard. And there's a few things which, if they happen, and if you try it, I'm going to say they're probably going to happen, they make it, shall we say, less than great. And I want to go through some of the most common and what we did to solve them. So I want to start with sleepy pairing. This is what I see most of the time whenever anybody tries this for the first time. And if you've ever done it, I'm sure you've seen it. You've got two people behind one machine. You've got one person. They're at the keyboard. They're feverishly typing away. They're working through the problem in their head. They're coming up with the solution. They're putting that into the computer. They're fighting it when it doesn't work. They're trying to do the whole process in their heads. The other person in the pair, not so much. They're generally doing either one or two things. They're either sitting just behind the person who's coding, staring over the shoulder, not saying much, just making them feel really, really judged while this person's watching. And that's not that pleasant. Alternatively, the other one that I've seen a lot is the person that's not involved, but just there. They'll sit kind of a meter away from the person at the keyboard. Maybe they'll sit, surreptitiously doing something on their phone, Facebook, Twitter, shooting zombies in an MMO. And just occasionally, they'll glance up at the screen, and then they'll go back to their phone. And I liken this to a car journey. If you're driving a long distance and you've got a car full of people, you have the driver who is concentrating the whole day. They're the person that is looking out at the road. They're the person that is trying to make sure that things are safe. They're trying to find the right way that we need to go, just trying to get to the destination. Passengers, they're struggling to stay awake. You can have that backseat driver making the person at the wheel feel really uncomfortable. I hate it when people do that. You get the people that just sit and stare out of the window, watch the world go by, not really doing anything. And then you have the people I'm really jealous of, the ones that don't get motion sickness, and they just spend the entire trip binge-watching Netflix until the phone battery dies. Now, at the end of our journey, that driver, they get out of the car, they stretch, they walk inside, they try and find somewhere to sit down. They've got a headache, their muscles have set, they just want to sleep. Sorry about the banks, by the way. The passengers, they're also exhausted. But of course, they're not exhausted from the stuff that they're doing. They're just more exhausted from being bored the whole day. And so it is with our developers in sleepy pairing. We have that driver, the one who's been doing all of the heavy lifting. They're more exhausted than they normally would have been because they've done exactly the same job as they normally would have done, only now they've done it with somebody watching and feeling judged the whole day. And the people watching, that person behind the shoulder, don't underestimate how tiring it can be to watch somebody writing code if you're not actively involved. It can really melt your brain within half an hour, let alone doing it all day. And that person sitting a meter away, they have an awesome score in the zombie game. They're really proud of their score. But they're not feeling quite so proud of the work they've done today. This probably isn't what they're getting paid for. And so the next day, everybody just goes back to their own machines. Assuming we're allowed back in the office, which I believe in the UK you are allowed now, we put on our headphones to just drown out the noise of that open office, and we go back to working independently. That previous day, complete waste of time. And you know what? So is pair programming. But it's not only the navigator that can be sleepy. Believe it or not, you can also get sleepy drivers, and it can lead to just as bad a situation. And I see this most often when teams first try and use the official driver-navigator roles behind the computer. You've got the driver. They have the keyboard. They are entering the code that the navigator tells them to. You've got the navigator. They're the person that's now thinking of the solution and telling the driver what to actually type. Now, doing this, it does have an instant effect of both people have to be involved now. Because that driver, they can't enter the code into the computer if you're not telling them what to say. So you need both people to be involved, talking to each other. We are now working together to solve problems. We have our navigator working through the problem, finding the solutions, telling the driver's taking that, they're putting it in, they're typing it at the keyboard. Sounds idyllic, it's what I want. People around the typist are now actively involved. We've got no more yupping, and we've got no more zombies, and here we go for a quick microphone change. Now this is good. Which hand do you hold the microphone in? Let's try this one. We have no more yupping, and we have no more zombies. Only I'm not sure. At this point, there can quite easily be a zombie. It's just not in that game on the phone anymore. It's the typist. And I started to use that word deliberately, typist. They are sitting there, they are banging in the words and symbols and characters that the navigator is telling them to type. But while they're doing this, they're not thinking about what goes into the computer. Have you ever seen the stories in the newspapers? Wow, that ages me. Have you ever seen stories online about drivers who end up at the wrong destination. They follow everything that their sat-nav says, and they just do it without any kind of thought whatsoever. They end up lost. They end up in the middle of a field. The two worst ones that I've actually read about are when people have ended up in water or even in a different country because they happened to put in a city and street which existed in two countries and they didn't bother checking which one they were going to. Your navigation system says to you, "You have arrived." And you go, "Well, yeah. Where? How did I get here? Why on earth are my feet wet?" And for our developers, we're still exhausted. We're now exhausted for different reasons, though. The navigator is exhausted because they have been doing all of the thinking. They've not had any help. They've not had any input. Only now they've been doing all of this thinking and telling the driver what to do, but that driver's not using their IDE. That driver's not using their keyboard shortcuts. They're being held up by that driver not working as fast as they want that driver to work, and they can't carry on thinking of the solution because otherwise you're going to get lost between each other, and so it just drags and it's hard. And that typist, bashing the keys with no thought. They're also exhausted because it's also, as hard as it is to watch somebody code all day, it's also hard to just sit and listen to somebody telling you to put that if statement on line 15, no, not there, put it a space in, don't forget that bracket. I did not become a developer just to put somebody else's code into my computer. And I'm not including Stack Overflow here. That counts. We can do that. So the next day, we return to our own machines. Noise-cancelling headphones, drown out the open plan office, and we go back to working independently again. That previous day, that was a complete waste of time. And you know what? Except for complicated problems, so is pair programming. Now with these two issues, that sleepy navigator, that sleepy driver, getting past this point is really, really hard. I've worked in teams where we have hit this repeatedly and struggled to make our way past. But there are things that we can do to change this and to actually get that feedback and that way of working that I want from doing pair programming. First of all, let's see if we can tackle the sleepy navigator. One thing we noticed when we started to pair is just the sheer volume of interruptions that we got. Now, we started to do this before COVID, so we were in that open plan office. And in the real world, it's just a nightmare sometimes. You got somebody 2 desks down and they're having an ad hoc meeting loudly. You got people on the phone. You got people walking up and down past the desks in your peripheral vision, just really getting in the way and pulling you out of your concentration zone. Even worse, if you're the navigator, because we're software developers, and software developers type. So if you're not typing, you're not busy, you can be interrupted, and nobody thinks what you could be doing. We also have virtual interruptions, like the phone. Even if you're not sitting playing on that zombie game, in modern society, we're addicted to our phones. I know that I am. And there's a world of distractions that they can give to us, even if they're not actively in our hands. We have email, Slack, Teams, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram. And we get little dopamine hits every time we check one of these notifications. I was reading an article about a neurological study. Our brains are wired different because of our phones. We get that used to the dopamine that it actually becomes a physical connection thing in our head to check it. And even without having just the, is there a notification? Is there not a notification? When you're navigating and your fingers aren't dancing across the keyboard, it might be that you need something in your hands to keep you going. And phones provide that for you. And yeah, it's just something that we do. I know that it's something that I was also guilty of, and I found it really hard to change this. First of all, I tried to do, just put my phone a bit of a distance away, because then I can't check it. And I found that all I did was just reach, check it, reach, and put it back. And I was doing this unconsciously. Great for the daily workout, not so good for concentration. Eventually, what I had to do was just get rid of it completely. I was pairing on the desk opposite mine, so I just tossed it between the monitors onto my desk, carefully, glass smartphone, not a Nokia 3310, and it really hurt. It really, really hurt because I am addicted to my phone. But over time, I also noticed that my concentration level was actually skyrocketed. And all of those things that you get the dopamine from, you know what? It's just the fear of missing out. You don't need to check everything constantly as we do. Email was different. The issue that I had with my email is working behind my machine, I got a pop-up if an urgent email came in. Now we can argue whether or not this is a good or a bad thing, but it happened. And it meant that if something really urgent came in, there was a question that needed answering right now. There's an issue and we all need to get together to solve it. Production's on fire and the website's down. It's in my email, I see it instantly. If I'm sitting at somebody else's computer, I still get those on my phone. I've not got my phone anymore. And it did stress me out not knowing what was going on. I guess it's also a type of addiction. But the more I thought about it and the more I got used to it, it's pointless. If something is that urgent that you not answering it straight away is going to be a problem, they're going to find you. They're not just going to send off the email and go, well, they're going to get back to us now. We can ignore it. Just ignore the fire. It'll go out by itself. And if they don't come and find you, it's not that urgent and they didn't need to interrupt you. It's really hard to do, but over time, I managed to make it work. So working on removing the distractions, we really found that we could get into that pair and work together an awful lot better than we did before. But we've only dealt with the navigator so far. We also had the issue of that sleepy driver who just zones out and just randomly types in what the other person's saying. This one wasn't an individual thing. Getting rid of the distractions as a navigator, everybody's going to have their own distractions. You're going to have to figure out what yours are and get rid of them. As a driver, it's more of a team effort, and we really need to figure out what to do to make this work. So what we did is we examine the whole concept of the driver and navigator and try and make them a little bit more specific. So we came up with the navigator, somebody who thinks of a solution. But they don't tell the driver what to do at a key press level. Rather, they tell the driver their idea, their solution, they walk through it. And they do that until the driver understands enough to turn that understanding into code and then put it into the machine. And our driver, it wasn't somebody who just thoughtlessly did what they were told. It was somebody who listened to the navigator, who worked at understanding what the navigator was saying. And they turned that understanding into code, and put their own code into the machine, not the navigators. I want to return to the driving metaphor one last time. And when you're driving and you're using satellite navigation, your job isn't to just thoughtlessly take that information and do it without thinking. Your job as a driver is to think about those instructions. Are they going to get you to the right place? Are they going to get you to the right place safely, should you be turning up to this road? Is the road itself safe to use these instructions, or do I need to ignore them and find some other way? And so it is with the driver in pair programming. It's not just somebody who follows what the navigator's saying and bashes it in at the keyboard. It's somebody who listens to the navigator. They try to understand the navigator. And when you don't understand, you don't do anything. You tell the navigator you're not sure what they're trying to do, and the navigator in response needs to work to get that understanding there. And if you really can't get at it, your job is to then find a different way to explain it. Maybe you need to stand up and go to a whiteboard and you need to work through your thoughts together, make sure you're both on the same page. And this isn't a disadvantage of pair programming. When you do this, you get even better solutions. What you don't do, and I have had people try to do to me, is say, just give me the keyboard 2 seconds, I'll just do this and then you can carry on again. And you don't do that because at that point the driver isn't involved at all. They're not a sleepy driver or navigator, they're just watching from the sidelines doing nothing. And as a driver, you don't get it any easier. Because when you're thinking through these solutions, when you're putting your code into the computer, at some point you are going to get a stunning idea. And at that point, what you don't do is just instantly starting to put your undoubtedly awesome solution into the computer. Because when you do that, the navigator's not involved again. You're now putting your code into the computer. They don't even know what you're thinking. They can't think along with you. So rather what you do is you excitedly give that keyboard to the navigator. You switch roles. You become the navigator, to quote the 80s film, and you get them to understand your ideas and you switch. This also keeps the pairing alive because now you switch roles and you have different ways of thinking and different things to do. It can help you not fall asleep when you're doing this. And if we do this, if we ensure that each person fills the roles in this way without distraction, being an active member of the pair, then we can move from sleepy pairing into strong pairing. Now, when this happens, it's all awesome. But for the last 2 years, we've not really been in the office, and I've only talked about sitting next to somebody so far. So what about remoting? I appreciate we're going back to the office now, but I, for one, am not aiming to go back 5 days a week. So what can we do to do this remotely? Well, the first time I gave this talk was in 2020 in Sweden. And I was asked to be on a podcast directly afterwards, a live podcast, part of the conference, and to talk about pair programming, obviously. At some point, one of the hosts asked me a question which was an absolute curveball for me. It's like, okay, so we've got pair programming. What about remotely? Do you think you can pair remotely? I honestly didn't know. I think I actually answered with, And what I said at the time was, I'd done it once, and it worked. It was a colleague and I were busy in the morning, we were pairing in the morning, but in the afternoon, something was going on at my home, and I needed to be there. But we wanted to carry on pairing because we got so far in the morning. Now, the situation at that company was weird because our IT department had an insane amount of control over our computers. We didn't have video and we didn't have audio, but we still wanted to try pair programming. So we were using Slack, we were using screen sharing. At one point, we just had Notepad opened and both of us were stealing the keypad to type to each other. And it was really, really hard. But it also worked. It wasn't as good as it was in the morning. We were a lot slower than we were in the morning, but it did work. But I thought at that time that the only way you're going to make this work is to have loads of psychological safety, which you need in pair programming anyway, but you're really going to have a good connection with that person to make this work remotely. And you're going to need that before you try. And the colleague I was working with, we had an awesome relationship. So this did work. I paired with him all the time. To be honest, I paired with him too much. It was to the detriment of the other people in the team. Because we could bounce so well from each other, we should have mixed and matched way more than we did. But it meant that even in that woefully inadequate situation that we had, typing messages to each other in Notepad, we still made it work. But I still ended with, if you've not got psychological safety before you start, Now, I think it's going to be quite challenging to do pair remoting. That was 3 weeks before the Netherlands went into lockdown. And at the time, I was also changing jobs. In fact, from that conference, I got back and started the new job. I spent 3 weeks with the teams before lockdown, and my job was to change the way that they work, so nobody liked me that much, because nobody likes being told to change. Nobody really likes being shown what's wrong and needs changing and asking what they're going to do to change it. But now we're suddenly working from home. And this team that had never paired before suddenly started to do it. In fact, one team started to mop. They just had everybody in one call, and they worked together to solve problems. And the amount of work in progress they had actually went down to 1 or 2 stories because they really focused together. And they did that without building up the trust level, because they did not pair in the office in any way, shape, or form. And it worked. The team started to really enjoy it. They did it more and more. And I'm going to be honest, I think they actually did it as much because they missed the connection from the office as they did for anything else. Because in the office, you have lots of contact moments. Even if you're not pairing with somebody, you have a chat, you have coffee, you have lunch together. And they were missing this, and they replaced it with pairing. And whilst it worked, there were some things that became painfully obvious after a few weeks. Number one, sleepy pairing and remote pairing, so much harder to avoid. That one is super difficult because when you're working remotely, you can work really hard, you're at the keyboard, you're thinking, but you can't see them, you can't hear them, and they just drift off. And like I say, physically next to you, you can notice when somebody's zoning out. You notice the change in how they're acting. You've got all sorts of pointers that can make you say, you know what? Let's take a break. Let's go grab a cup of coffee. Let's get some fresh air. We'll come back. We'll start again. And remote pairing, we just didn't do that. The other thing that we had is switching roles. That whole thing of just give me the keyboard doesn't work when you're miles apart. It's super hard to see each other's screens because we've all got different resolutions. I love 4K monitors, my colleagues love ultra-wide monitors, and neither of us can see each other's code. Because when I see their code, even though I've got a higher resolution, it's all squashed because it's a widescreen monitor. When they see my code, they say black bars down the side and everything's super, super tiny, and you've got to work hard to make this happen. And then when we switch code, you've got to do a commit. You've got to push it up to the repo. The other person's got to pull it. They've got to open the solution on their machine. And why were we doing this anyway? What was the idea that why did we switch pairs? It all disappears, and it's so much harder to do. And so we just didn't switch as often as we should. The person that started in the morning was probably still pairing at lunchtime, and that also doesn't help the sleepy pairing, of course, because then nobody's actively keeping up. So there were a couple of issues. The other one was the whole bouncing ideas. And I'm sure we've all had this in online team meetings and things. 2 people talking at once in a team meeting doesn't work. 1 person talking into a really poor microphone doesn't work. It can be really hard to follow along. It can be really hard to communicate. And it's just that level of difficulty above being in the office, and it's all the more tiring to do. And that means that you can go quiet. It means that you can lose the thread of what you're trying to do. And again, you lose people. Everybody goes sleepy. How did we try and solve these things? One thing we did is live share, which Visual Studio Code, you can do live share. And it's one of 2 things. Live share is either truly, truly awesome and it's spectacular, or it is profanity-inducing annoyance when it doesn't do what you want it to do. When it works, it's great. And it's great because I'm no longer looking at that person's widescreen monitor. I'm now following what they're doing on my machine. I'm following what they're doing in my editor with my theme, with my extensions, and it's just so much nicer. And when you want to switch, it's really easy. You just say, I've got a great idea. Let me take over a second. You watch. Because I can just instantly start typing, and it appears on their machine. For the times when we couldn't use live share for whatever reason, one of the things that we actually started doing was using the Pomodoro technique. It wasn't perfect, but it actually helped us a great amount. 25 minutes, and then you must switch roles. So we know we've got a context switch coming up in 25 minutes. What can we get done? What is our plan for the next 25 minutes? You get to the end, you commit your hopefully working code, push it up to the repo, and then you take a break for 5 minutes to refresh, you come back, and you can start again. It's not perfect, but it did help keep people engaged, because if you're the person who's going to have to be at the keyboard in 5 minutes, you better know what's going on. Otherwise, it's going to be really interesting when you come back from coffee. And the last thing that we did to try and help the people that disappeared into the distance was we used a devil's advocate in the team. So generally, if we were mobbing with more than 2 people, we made sure that there was one person, switched the roles regularly, but there's one person that is watching for people disappearing as well as thinking along with us. And if somebody's been quiet for 10 minutes, then we would deliberately drag them back into the conversation. It's like, you've been quiet. You know, what do you think? Do you think we've got any problems here? Do you think we're on the right track? And just really work on getting that engagement back. And the other one that did, of course, is when you drag that person back, they see things that you've not seen, and you actually just make your stuff even better. Remote pairing, it is hard. It is harder than in the office, but if you've got the discipline, it can work amazingly well, and we have ebbs and flows. I'm going to be completely honest. Sometimes the teams are awesome, and sometimes the teams are just, I'm going to be kind and say tired. But overall, we get some really great results from it. So let's have a quick talk about what those results are of pair programming. Why do I love it so much? Well, first of all, that collaboration. The bit that I really want when working with my colleagues. We are working together. We are, as a team, focused on producing one thing, solving one problem, and getting it to the finish line, not leaving half-finished work for somebody to come back to later. We do this and we bounce ideas between each other. We encourage each other and really try and make sure that we can think of the best solution possible for the particular problem that we're solving. We help each other learn, whether that's with our domain knowledge, because as developers, we're not always experts in the domain that we're in. I work in a really complex domain, and I don't want to be an expert. But you need to get to a certain level, and when you're pairing with each other, you can find out just the edge cases that you know you need to take care of in the future, and it just takes your level up that little bit. We can help people with tech stacks. This has worked really well for front and back ends. We have an Angular front end, we have the C# back end, and our front-end developer actually works with the back-end team, and the back-end team works with the front-end developer. And as a result, as long as we're not talking about HTML and CSS, because I don't think I will ever understand those, we have developers now that can work on each one, and they can flip backwards and forwards. And we're much more rounded than we used to be. And yeah, we'd used that extra knowledge to solve those complex technical and business problems. We communicate way more than we did before. Everybody knows what's going on. And I always find this one chicken and egg, because I don't know what happened. I don't know whether or not, in order to learn to pair better, we learned to communicate better, or whether or not we went the other way. And we learned to communicate, and the pairing followed that along because we could communicate. Either way, it works a lot better when you can talk to each other with more understanding. And it also means that we're sharing knowledge because we're working together. And we're sharing it by default because we're in a pair, we're in a mob. Which means that when that person wins a lottery and quits, or goes on vacation, or unfortunately ill, it doesn't give us a huge problem anymore. because you've always got somebody who's got that knowledge as well, the other person in the pair. And they can start pairing with somebody new, and then you spread the knowledge yet again. And again, you just spread it naturally. You don't need handover moments. You don't need knowledge sharing sessions, because it's just by default in the way that we work. I also loved what it did to our PR process. I hate PRs. I think they're a context switching nightmare. That might be an unpopular opinion. I know some people I work with, it's an unpopular opinion, but if I can do something different to that, I will do. And when we started pairing and we did it right, it became a lot smoother. And it became a lot smoother because the driver is validating the idea of the navigator. Is this the solution that I understand and I can put into the machine? And when the driver's putting their solution into the machine, the navigator can go, is that what I had in mind when I was saying this? Are we communicating about the same thing? Now that it's going into the code together, can we spot issues that we wouldn't have spotted otherwise? And it's a real-time, ongoing pull request, basically. It's a constant code review. When we came to pull request, because our rules demanded it, we took our commit, we walked through it one last time just to make sure that nothing snuck in that we hadn't realized. And then the person behind the machine made the pull request, and the navigator walked to their machine, and they approved it. And that last step I was talking about, double-checking what you've done before you actually commit the code, that is so important, because you'd be amazed at how often something can sneak in unintentionally, especially if you're fighting a problem. If you don't do that, then this whole thing is lost. You lose the benefit of this entirely. Please make sure you do it. But it was so much better than our old PR process, which I'm sure we've all dealt with before. You finish your work, you throw it at a colleague. Either you have to wait for them to finish what they're doing, or you have to interrupt what they're doing. They make comments, they throw it back to you. You have to context switch back to what you were doing before, because it's not what you're doing now. And this ping pong can happen, and the worst that I've seen between a couple of developers is like 3 days, this going backwards and forwards asynchronously, and it really hindered the team's ability to move forward because it was just stuck. Also, if you do the late pull request, if somebody spots something really in the foundation of the change that you've done and you need to change it, it can mean a complete rewrite of what you've been doing for the last 2 days. It can mean that you've totally gone down the wrong path. You need to undo that and start again. And sometimes it's easier to just abandon it and start again. It's also easy at that point to go, yeah, but this is really important and it's really urgent and we've got to get this out. So just approve the pull request and we'll make a new story to fix it later. Later never comes because it's no longer important to the product owner. So when we do this on the fly in pair programming, we don't have that context switch. The only context switch we have is when we approve the pull request, grab a cup of coffee and then start on the next task. And that's a context switch I can live with. Finally, the one which I was not expecting when we started down this path is the onboarding process. When starting a new job, you go into a new company, surrounded by new people. It's really daunting. You get introduced to 100 people, and you forget their names instantly. And then you go, you get your machine, you install it, and you have a massive pile of paper or a wiki entry, or if you're really unfortunate, 144 project solution that you've got to manually trawl through to find out what's going on, to get the understanding of the system that you're working in. And I've heard managers say that they won't judge a developer's effectivity for 2 or 3 months after they've joined because they know the complexity of the system. And I think that's really sad that we have to do that. But rather than doing that, after that person has forgotten everybody's name and installed their machine, get them to pair with somebody. And when we do this, that newbie that's just getting into it, they get a huge boost about how the domain works, why certain decisions were taken, why the solution is set up in the way that it is, how the team produced their code. And the person you're pairing with they get a benefit too. They get the benefit of somebody with no preconceived ideas about the project looking at it and asking difficult questions. It's not going to be as effective as having two experienced people pairing together, but it's way more than just having somebody sitting trying to trawl through this manually on their own, and they're productive from day one. I adore pair programming, and I love advocating for pair programming, and I did a lot in my old job, I do a lot in my new job, and I do get asked why sometimes. And I want to quote G. Hill from Twitter, who does a lot of stuff about TDD. What he says about TDD is, why do we do this? Because we are in it for the money. When I pair, when I practice, when I get it right, I get value into the hands of my users more quickly. I get value into the hands of my users with more thought put into it. More thought about how we're actually going to solve the problem and the code that we do in order to solve it. I love pairing. I love it with one person. I love it with multiple people. I love it because of the benefits that I see it brings to me as an individual, a team, and the company that I'm working for. Now, make no mistake, this is hard. If pairing was easy, we'd all just be doing it because it would be easy. But even though it's hard, I invite you to give it a go out of your comfort zone, work your way through those sleepy stages, find what you need to do to turn it into strong pairing for you, and to see what benefits it can bring you. I've been Stacy Cashmore. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed that, really. Anybody has any questions? You may raise your voice.
Yeah, hi, I have a question around the psychological safety. Can you explain what you mean by that and any examples of how you've gone about building psychological safety with colleagues and also with the team environment as well?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is about psychological safety, what it is, and how you can build it up within your teams. What I mean by psychological safety is being prepared to let yourself fail with your colleagues. You've got to be open to somebody telling you that what you've done isn't right. You've got to be open for somebody to be able to tell you there's a better way of doing things. And allow the team members to have direct communication. So you don't need to be nasty, but you don't need to sugarcoat this. You've got to be able to actually have those frank conversations with each other. How to build it? That's a tough one. I think whatever, software development, it depends. I think the only time when I've really seen that I couldn't get it working is when there was a toxic member of the team. As soon as you have a toxic member of the team, I'm going to be honest, that's a management issue. Because at some point you can't move past that as a team. But what you need to do is start small. I'd recommend feedback training to get the people to learn to communicate with each other, learn how to communicate with each other, and start small and build up. If you don't have the psychological safety at the start, you can't go full on to be able to go, what are you doing that for? That's a ridiculous way of doing it. I don't get it. I can do that with half my colleagues. I wouldn't do it with the other half. You've really got to know who you're talking to and what level of safety exists, and make sure that you can do that at the right level. It takes time, it takes effort, and I think the big one is to make sure you've not got somebody toxic there. That's an absolute killer. That's awful. Does that help? So how do we handle different levels of experience within the pairs, and do we pair differently depending on the people we're pairing with? I think first off, it's always different. Doesn't matter who I'm pairing with. It's always different for that person because you have the personalities of the people as well. So I know the people that I can really get away with being sarcastic and over the top, and I know the people that I have to be very businesslike and keep everything a little bit formal. When it comes to the different levels, what we try and do, and what we've seen works, is if you've got a junior developer and a more senior developer, then maybe we'll start with the senior developer being the navigator to ease them into it, get them to know the system, but also be really open and to push to change regularly. Because the last thing that you want to do is just turn into, I'm the senior and I'm going to tell you how to code this. You really need to make sure that you encourage that person at the keyboard to also come out of their comfort zone and grow. And I've been quite lucky in my career. I have met quite a few junior developers that have just been beyond awesome. And once you actually get them thinking, you get them going down a certain path, their neurons fire, and they might not have the experience, and they might need help in shaping what comes out of it. But yeah, they've come out with absolutely stunning solutions, and I have learned from junior developers, and I'm really happy to get a junior developer that I can learn from. Okay, so have we put two juniors together and tried to give them general guidance is kind of the question. And I'm afraid I can't really answer that one because the companies that I've worked in, I've had to push them to hire juniors, so we've not had too many juniors that we could put together in one team. The one thing that I would say is when it comes to junior developers and senior developers, I'm going to quote a speaker from Microsoft on this. I have worked with too many senior developers who aren't senior developers as well. What the speaker says is, do you want 20 years worth of experience, or do you want 20 times 1 year's experience? So even if I've got a senior developer coming in, I will try and make sure that they are a senior developer by working with them as well. And yeah, just trying to mix the team up. And I try not to treat junior developers too differently aside from giving them enough coaching to allow them to really come out of their shell. It's the junior developers I've known, they've all too often had confidence issues because I'm the junior developer, I can't tell you what to do. And it's like, well, you just come up with great ideas, so you do know what to do, so what would you want to do next? And really try and get them involved and try and take away some of that inferiority complex that I know some people can have. Awesome. Yeah. If you've got somebody that really doesn't want to take part, what can you do? The first thing I'd probably do is take them out of the office and go for a long walk with them. Try and find out where the problem lies. So I've got a number of people at the moment that I'm working with, and one of them is, I don't know if this sounds nasty or not, but he's a 1990s programmer. I started coding in the 90s, and I recognize what he does from the 90s. He's really, give me specs, I will come back in 3 months, and you can tell me whether or not it's good. And that's challenging, and he really doesn't want to change. So that one, again, that That is it. I am not management. I do not want to be management. I'm happy I don't have that issue. The other one that we have is of trying to get people to try it. And again, it comes back to the whole psychological safety thing. It's most of the people I know who are sleepy, they're not actively against it. They're just, it's very confrontational to be able to sit in a pair. And I do this as a senior as well. I can sit in a pair and say to the person next to me, I've never used this technology. This is all new for me. You're going to have to help me a bit more than normally we would do. Where do we need to start here? It took me many years to get to the stage where I was unafraid enough, I'm not going to say confident enough because I'm not, but unafraid enough to be able to admit that and move forward. So I find a lot of it is trying to help people feel comfortable in that and realize that not everybody knows everything. And the whole thing of that 10 by developer is a wonderful myth which terrifies, I'm going to say probably 90% of the people that I know. And the others think that they're 10 times developer and they scare the other 90%, not necessarily because of how good they are. Welcome.